I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 87. Today on the show, we're joined by Whit Fosburgh of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and we're going to be discussing the top conservation issues for 2016. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today we're doing something that I want to continue to do more often here on the podcast, and that's dive into the important issues related to conservation across this country and across North America in general. I mean, I know that I do, and we all do, enjoy talking about exciting hunts and big deer, new strategies, all that kind of good stuff, but we couldn't do any of these things if we didn't have wild lands and healthy animal populations on those lands which we can pursue. So I decided that I and we here at Wired to Hunt, we all need to do a better job at giving back and working towards these types of goals. And I'm hoping that maybe a few of you will want to do that too. So, over the past year or so, we've had a number of episodes where we've talked about these types of topics. We've talked with Stephen Ranella, we've talked with Randy Newberg, Shane Mahoney, and a few other people like that, but we want to continue. And today I think we're really going to take a step in the right direction with that, as we're going to be tackling the top conservation issues for 2016. And joining us is someone who I think is going to be perfect to help us have that discussion, and that's Whit Fosburgh, the president and CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And if some of you aren't familiar with what the TRCP is, I'm going to let Whit tell you a little bit more about them in just a few minutes, but at a super high level, just to give you a basic idea, the TRCP is it's a conservation organization that I've been really impressed with over recent years. And I think that's because their mission is such an important one, and it's not focused, just on one certain subset of hunters. They're working for all hunters and anglers at a high national level. It's not just deer hunters, not just elk hunters, not just duck hunters or anything like that, which, those types of conservation groups obviously are important too, but I appreciate the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership's focus on habitat and, the fact that impacts all of our pursuits. So I think that's pretty clear when you take a look at their mission statement, in which they talk about their mission being to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish. So with all that said, I know Whit can do a much better job of explaining what the TRCP is all about, and then share with us some interesting things about what those top conservation issues are this year. But before we get Whit on the phone, we do need to do what we do always on this episode or on this podcast, and that's take a couple minutes to update you on what's going on new with me and Dan on the home front. So I don't know about you, Dan, but I'm kind of still recovering post ATA. How you doing?
Yeah, I ended up taking Friday off as well. I got home at about 8 o'clock on Thursday night. So I had planned on going to work, but my wife begged me to stay so I could watch the kids so she could get some, because she works out of the basement for her part-time job. And so I stayed home, kind of relaxed this weekend and played with the kids and went to one of my buddy's birthday parties and just kind of kind of was a little lazy.
That's needed after
Yeah.
the long days we had last week, I'd say.
I tell you what, I made the mistake of wearing a new pair of shoes to the show and doing all that walking. I was, it broke my shoes in, but it also broke my feet.
Yeah, and you can always tell it's like you're walking for hours and hours, and at least for me, I don't feel it until I sit down. And then when I finally
Right.
sit down for a meeting or something, all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, there's a huge literal relief off of my feet now.
Right.
So same here, though. Once I got back on Friday, I was just kind of a lump on a log. I just needed to rest and recover a little bit. That's a lot of social interaction for me, you know? Like
Right.
after I sit in my office by myself most of the time, and then all of a sudden I was talking to 1 million people for 4 days straight. So it wore me out.
And for me, so my goal there was to try to get as many contacts from as many people for my podcast. And I said the same thing over and over and over and over again, to the point where I was going delirious.
Did you ever like fall into autopilot mode and then like accidentally say the wrong company name or something like that?
Yeah, I did.
Did you really?
It was for a trail camera company. I had just went from one trail camera company to the next trail camera company, and I said their name, and the guy looked at me funny, I insulted him or something.
Oh man, I can't blame you. After talking to that many people, I'd do the same thing.
Right.
So hunting season's done for both of us. Now we're in the next phase of the season, I guess. Like we always say, the season never really ends. It's just on to the next phase, which is postseason and all that good stuff. But I don't know about you, but at this time of year, especially, I start thinking about these bigger picture issues, like, you know, all these different high-level national topics that influence hunting and fishing from a conservation standpoint. I've been doing a lot of reading. I'm always doing a lot of reading, but reading particularly on these types of topics. So I don't know. I'm pretty excited to dive into this and learn a little bit more. Are you?
Yeah, definitely. I love hearing this stuff because, although I guess I'm going to call myself a wannabe conservationist, because I spend the money on my tags. I follow all the laws. I don't go out and I don't plant trees. I'm a member of some associations, but other than that, I really don't do much. So it's good to hear from these guys on what guys like me can do to be a better conservationist.
Yeah, I think your situation is one that is probably common to most guys and girls out there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us realize these things are important, but there's so much stuff going on, especially if you're just kind of focused on, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis from a hunting standpoint. It's easy to not know about these bigger picture things that are happening that could really impact you and
Right.
what you do as a hunter or fisherman, but you never know about it unless you're actively trying to follow certain media places that they talk about these conservation issues and things. So there's some serious things going on in Washington, D.C. and across the country that could really influence, what we can do as deer hunters at home, or what we could do in the future if we want to go on trips to different parts of the country or whatever. All sorts of stuff going on that I think just happens behind the scenes that if we did know about it, or if more people knew about it, I think more people would take action to make a difference. So I think one way that I'm trying to make an impact, I hope, a positive impact, is by shedding light on some of these issues that maybe a lot of deer hunters don't know about, but we should. So
Right.
that's what I hope we can get today out of this conversation, is just bring awareness to some important topics that maybe are flying under the radar.
Yep, and that's one thing that I've found. It's to do something like this, you can't really do it half-assed. You have to make an attempt to focus on following, something like what we're doing today, or the National Deer Alliance, or whatever your cause, I guess, is. It literally takes focus and a real drive to do it, because then you get someone like me who I get to hunt, but the majority of my time is spent as father and husband, and there's other things that consume my time, and you really got to focus on going out and finding this information.
Yeah, that's the truth. I think that's probably one of the greatest challenges, is just keeping people aware of what's going on, and then number two, finding a way to make it easy for people to take action on some of these things. I think that's, the second big challenge that we've talked about in previous episodes is just, how do we actually do something about it? Because sometimes it can kind of seem intimidating. What can little old me actually do to make an impact on this big issue? And lots of times, maybe writing a letter or sending an email or showing up at a rally or talking to a congressman or woman or anything like that. And those things sometimes can be tough to do if we don't know exactly how we're supposed to do it or when to do it or whatever it might be. So, I don't know. That's one of the things I want to think about this year and try to find more opportunities to raise awareness about certain things and then, demonstrate easy ways to take action. I think if we can do that, we can make a positive difference. So that's kind of one of my 2016 New Year's resolutions is to work on those things and then actually practice what I preach. I really want to make sure that we're doing the same things that we talk about that everyone should do. So
Right.
I don't know. That's my hopes and dreams for this year and for this episode. So I think we could probably learn a lot more, not by listening to you and me, but just getting Whit on the phone and having him share his wealth of information. So if you're ready, I'd say we should give Whit a call.
I think Whit is a badass name. Like, I think if I met a guy named Whit, I would never want to fight him.
I'll give you that. I wouldn't either. So let's stay on Whit's good side.
Okay, good.
All right. Let's take a very quick break for a word from our sponsors of this podcast, and then we'll give Whit a call. So, as we do every week, we're joined now by Sitka product category leader Dennis Zuck. And today I want to continue a conversation we started last week when he told us a little bit about the development process for new products at Sitka. So today I want Dennis to elaborate a little and tell us about what kinds of different people and teams are part of this process of actually taking something from just an idea to an actual finished product that we someday see on the shelves. So here's Dennis.
Yeah, so for us, we have our athletes and our ambassadors and the folks that we work with who kind of come up with, this is what I need or this is what I don't have. And it flows, to me. And I'm sitting there thinking about, okay, well, how might we address that or what might we use? And so I write up what we call a brief, and we have designers that are sitting there who are really experts in apparel and think about, well, how can I execute that in an apparel design? Then we have developers, so that goes to them, and they're really good at making dreams come true, if you will. So they can take this really cool design that a designer's come up with and work with, all of our factories and folks to kind of bring that to life. We have material-specific people, people who understand laminates and, the Gore-Tex windstoppers kind of world. And we have people who understand, good base layers. So we have a variety of technical folks who understand materials, people who understand design, people who understand getting things done. So we have it's kind of an interesting group, and, a lot more hands touch it than probably most people realize.
So there you have it. And if you are interested in learning more about Sitka Gear or what new items they have in store for us in 2016, you can visit sitkagear.com. And now let's give Whit a call. All right, with us now on the line is Whit Fosburgh. Welcome to the show, Whit.
Thank you. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah, we were just chatting a couple minutes ago about kind of a renewed goal that we have here at Wired to Hunt and with the podcast in 2016 to just, focus more on conservation-related issues. We focus so much on the hunts and strategies and, how we can be successful hunters, which is great, but, none of that's possible if we don't have wild places and animals to pursue. So we're excited to have you on the line because I know that you are someone who is engaged in this topic. It sounds like probably every day of your life, most likely. So for those who aren't familiar with TRCP and with yourself, could you possibly give us a quick high-level overview of what the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership is and what you do with them?
Sure. The partnership was created in 2002, sort of as an outgrowth of the fact that the sportsman's voice had become pretty diluted in Washington. You had, a lot of individual species groups working on their, little niche issues and doing great stuff, restoring wetlands, fixing up trout streams, bringing back wild turkey, you name it. But they really rarely ever work together and put their collective muscle to the same big issues. We're really such big issues that were too much for any one group to tackle. The federal budget, agriculture policy, public lands policy, some of those really overlaying issues. So there was a fellow named Jim Range who had been a long-time hunter, angler, hill staffer, who decided he was going to create an organization that brought everybody together to work on conservation and access. And so today we have about 46 different partner organizations that range from the Turkey Federation and Ducks Unlimited to Coastal Conservation Association to QDMA, Whitetails Unlimited, really a broad spectrum, but also the Land Trust community, AFL-CIO, because 70% of their 12 million members hunt and fish, Outdoor Industry Association, because even though REI, EMS, those stores may not be totally in line with all of our issues as sportsmen, they agree with about 90% of what we work on, and we can really use that extra collective economic muscle to make our argument. So we have those 46 partner groups. We also have a corporate council of conservation-minded companies that come together to see what they can do to help the causes. And those range from Orvis and Plum Creek to Sitka and Schlumberger. So again, a big cross-section of corporate America, but companies that really care about conservation.
So what does your daily life, or what's your daily role look like in that? Because it sounds like this is a lot of work, really. I can't imagine that you... Go ahead.
It's all federal policy focused. So I'm not out there, fixing up a wetland. I'm not running a trout in the classroom class or a Jake's class or anything like that. We are focused 100% on what the federal government is doing or not doing and how that affects our hunting and fishing and access. And so, part of my job as a CEO is, raising money for the organization. We have about a $4 million annual budget. We have about 12 staffers here in D.C., got about another, dozen or so out in the field, primarily Rocky Mountain West, the public land states, but also in, Louisiana, and some other places that are, more, not exactly public land states. And then, so what we do is we really identify, the issues that are important to our members and our partners. And we organize working groups. So with something like agriculture, we have a wildlife and agriculture working group that consists of Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, Mule Deer Foundation, some others that have a real stake in what happens on private agricultural lands. And we get together and we coordinate and we develop joint positions. We do joint press. We do joint fly-ins to Washington. We do joint organizing out in the field. We tend to be, sort of the group that tends to pull folks together and get them organized in these bigger issues, as well as providing some technical expertise, because this is what we do here in D.C.
When I think about that type of thing going on in D.C., when I think about just these conservation issues and the kind of play that they do or don't get in Washington, D.C., I just think about the chaos of what seems to be going on in Washington. And my assumption, when I think about this, is it's got to be really, really difficult to get across your message to some of these people. As I think, based on what I've seen, a lot of our country is becoming more and more disconnected from topics like habitat and conservation, all these things, as more and more people are urbanized. Do you face some significant challenges when you're trying to speak to these people in Washington about these issues that maybe they can't relate to at all personally?
Yeah, we do, because I think you make some really good points. I mean, the nation is changing. We're becoming a less rural country. We're becoming a more urban country. A lot of our old protectors in Congress in the old days, listen, everybody hunted and fished, and it was sort of taken for granted that Congress would look out for interests. I mean, those times have changed. So which is really why we have to sort of band together and make sure that we're not just thinking about something from a mule deer perspective or a whitetail perspective or a turkey perspective, but really thinking collectively, because you sort of look at some of the gun issues. An attack on any gun law, any place, is perceived as an attack on everybody. But with us in conservation, it's the exact opposite. If it's a pheasant problem, it's not really a duck problem. If it's a duck problem, it's not a trout problem. It's not a redfish problem. So we die the death of 1,000 cuts. And what we try to do is bring together and present, in a collective fashion, what our case is. And I think we have a pretty strong case, because we tend to be, the middle of the road people. Most hunters, anglers, they tend to be pretty moderate people, not extremists on one side or the other. They care about conservation. They've been brought up in it. They get it, and it's something they see as a fabric of this country. And so I think that whereas a lot of environmental issues have been really heavily politicized and polarized, either by the rape and ruin guys on one side and the save everything people on the other side, we can sort of steer that middle ground and really espouse solutions that make sense and that the majority of folks can get behind. But part of the challenge has been sort of getting our message to stand out in the the broad clutter of Washington. So instead of talking about what's good for quail or what's good for pheasant, we tend to talk about the jobs that hunting and fishing provide in the rural economies. I mean, people don't really think about it, but outdoor recreation, including hunting and fishing, is a $646 billion a year industry. That makes it the third largest sector of the entire economy. Bigger than oil and gas, bigger than pharmaceuticals. We're only behind healthcare and the financial sector. But we're so diffuse, so disorganized, nobody knows that. So part of our challenge is really presenting it in different ways and using a lot of facts to back up our arguments.
Speaking of kind of these challenges of getting these various voices to come together, one aspect of the outdoor recreation community, or one portion of it, being, if you want to call them the non-consumptive users, like backpackers, bikers, hikers, all that kind of stuff. We hear a lot about how hunters and anglers pay for conservation in this country, right? We talk about how our license fees and the taxes and everything that from our purchases go to really manage most of these places to provide a lot of the protection for these places. This is something I've just recently been hearing more and more about, and I think it was something that actually was proposed as a bill some number of years ago and was shot down, but recently have heard more people rumbling about it. Do you think that non-consumptive use, or is there a push for non-consumptive users to begin to give financially back in some portion? Maybe there's a recreational use fee, or is that something does that make sense? Would that be good for all of us, for hunters and anglers, or from a hunting and angling perspective, is it better that we foot the bill for conservation?
Well, I think there are two arguments. I mean, one, I think because we foot the bill, we have more ownership in the management of the resources, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, it's a shrinking pie out there, and we cannot afford ourselves, our community, to pay for the stuff the way we've done it in the past. But I think it makes total sense to have some sort of fee, excise tax, whatever you may want to call it, on other segments of the community. Heck, if you did something on mountain bikes and that was dedicated toward trail maintenance on our public lands, bird seed, and that goes toward neotropical migratory bird conservation. I think there are a lot of ways that you can earmark some of these funds to go very specifically with some of the interest groups that are associated with them. But it's a hard lift. I mean, Congress doesn't want to be seen as passing new taxes. A lot of the outdoor recreation community argues, and I think pretty fairly, that they get hammered on tariffs on things like apparel and fabrics. And if you can lower the tariffs some, then they would love to see an excise tax and have that money they're already paying go to conservation in this country and not just go into the general debt. So I think there's a real room to have that happening. There's a blue-ribbon panel that's been assembled by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to look at this very question. And it's being chaired by Johnny Morris at Bass Pro Shops and Dave Friedenthal, who's the former governor of Wyoming. And that panel has been taking testimony, meeting for the past 6 months or so, and I think we'll be coming out with recommendations in the next 2 months, if I'm correct. And then we'll see where that leads. Some of this may be voluntary on the part of industry, some of it may require new legislation congressionally. But there is just such a sense right now that any increase in revenue is a new tax that's going to be tough sledding. I mean, we saw how hard it was to get the price of the duck stamp increased, which we did year before last. And that is a straight user fee. I mean, the duck owners were asking for that to be increased so they could conserve more wetlands. But it was a multi-year slog to get that through Congress.
Yeah, I can only imagine the challenge of doing something like that, or working with these sometimes very separate entity or groups of people, trying to bring them together towards a common cause. Although sometimes you would think it makes sense to work together, I imagine there's fringe elements of both that don't want to. So and
that's always going to be the case. You just basically you pretty much ignore those people. But the 90% of the folks that are kind of in that middle range, you can work with. You may not agree on everything, but let's focus on the things we do agree on and not the things we disagree on. I mean, that's one of the fundamental problems of Washington the way it is today is we let the things we disagree on, dictate our relationships with everything else. And that's just not the way it ought to work. Nothing ever gets done.
Yeah. How much of Washington, I use that word in quotations, is a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of mentality that may not actually do what is the absolute best for conservation, but it helps us gain a little bit of momentum going forward.
Washington has changed a lot in recent years, and it is some of the old rules have kind of broken down, and so it's actually much tougher today to get stuff done than it used to be, because there used to be much more of that I scratch your back, you scratch my back kind of stuff that went on. And even that, as distasteful as some of that was, you could at least get stuff done. Even that is, much harder today because of just some of the rules that have changed in Congress and just some of the general polarization out there, because nobody wants to be perceived or be described as working with the enemy. So, it's tough. I think this will come around, and really the only way it makes it change is when, sort of that quiet middle majority, starts, saying that, let's be sensible, let's do what everyone knows needs to be done to fix some of these problems.
Yeah, I can imagine this type of conversation. I could talk to you for probably about 3 hours just about what's going on with these types of things, but that's probably not our best use of our time. I kind of want to make sure we focus from here on out on the issues that are happening, that are impacting impacting the land, impacting our habitat, impacting our ability to hunt, to access these places. So my kind of thought process was maybe we could hear on a high level what you think are the top issues from a conservation standpoint across the country, right now that we need to be thinking about. And then from there, maybe we can dive into each one individually and really get into the nitty-gritty of it. Does that sound like a pretty solid plan to you?
Yeah, that sounds great. I think the just sort of top level, and listen, I'm not going to hit everything because some of your listeners are going to have other ideas, and they'd be right. Those are big issues.
Sure.
But I just think that, in terms of the things that I see us working on, public lands would probably be number one. Just because, they're under such threats right now, and you see this clown show that's happening on Oregon with the militants taking over the National Wildlife Refuge. And that's emblematic of some of the dysfunction on our public lands and some of the hostility out there. And listen, we've got 646 million acres of public lands open for hunting and fishing in this country, or majority of it's open for hunting and fishing. And if that goes away somehow, then we're all in trouble. Second part I'd say is related to that would be access, and not just access to our public lands, well, that's an important part of it, but also how do we encourage landowners to open up the private lands for public access. We've seen the demographic shifts that are happening, and a lot more no trespassing signs going up and a lot more leases as opposed to just open lands, and that's going to have a direct result on hunter recruitment over time, and that's not in our interest. I'd say third is forest management, in particular on public lands. It's really tough to do management, even wildlife management, even management to reduce forest fire risk today, and something's going to need to be changed there in order to make things work a little bit better. I think agriculture and the whole conservation reserve program, I think we've seen what happens when land goes out of CRP, especially with pheasant populations, some of the upland bird populations, but also, deer use that land heavily. And we have to be providing these incentives for landowners to keep that land out of production in conservation to the extent they can. And then, finally, I would say the broad issue is sort of engaging the next generation. It's not something that we do in that, we're not out there, like the Jakes or the Green Wings or some of the programs that just some of the big national conservation groups have. But what can we do on the federal side to really, sort of help drive, hunter and angler recruitment and retention. So I'd say those are some of the really big issues right there.
Okay, so we've got a roadmap and a lot to cover, and I'm glad you mentioned these topics because a lot of these things were items on my mind that I've been following and personally want to learn more about. And given the fact that I spend so much time looking into this stuff and the fact that I'm still confused or want to understand some of these things better, I can't imagine how other people might. People need to hear about these things, so I'm glad that you can help us with this, Whit. And that first topic you brought up, public lands, is so relevant right now given what's happening in Oregon. But I think, and I wonder if some people don't see the tie-in there with what's happening in Oregon right now with the takeover of the refuge, and how that might be, or how it very clearly seems to be tied to this larger push to transfer and or sell public lands. Can you give us the lowdown on what's happening in Oregon from what do we need to know as sportsmen and women need to understand about what's happening there, and then number two, what's going on with this whole push for public lands transfer, and is that a real threat?
Yeah, so I think that I'll start with the second issue first, which is sort of the broader issue of public lands transfer. About 640 million acres of public lands in this country, and primarily in four main agencies. And that's the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park System. And all those lands are open for hunting and fishing, with the exception of some of the Park Service lands are not open for hunting. All in all, about if you think about hunting, about half the hunters in America hunt some or all the time on public land. And that may be a majority of, obviously, that's in the West, but even, I'm an East Coast guy. I grew up in the Adirondack Mountains, New York State. It's state land, but it's still public land. They're, near here in D.C., you got the George Washington National Forest that provides some great hunting and fishing. So it's not just a Western issue. But in the West, about 3/4 of all the hunting happens on public lands. And there has been, ever since Theodore Roosevelt really created the public land network back in the early 1900s, there has been, a lot of chafing from folks that want to get their hands on that land, primarily industry, and have tried to undo the public lands network. There was a great book written by a guy named Tim Egan, who was a former New York Times reporter, called The Big Burn, that talks about these huge fires in Montana and Idaho during, right after, Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, and how, that was really a galvanizing factor in having people rally behind the public lands and all the pressures there were to try to get rid of the public lands at that time. And, we've seen that same sort of thing, pop up periodically ever since. You think back in, sort of the old Sagebrush Rebellion during the 1980s, and, where, people were demanding that, public land be turned over and sort of stuff like that. It was kind of a sideshow at that time. But what we're seeing today is sort of an outgrowth of that, but a lot more sophisticated. We've seen a lot more money going into this. We have seen, sort of some of these, I would just sort of call them, sort of dark money groups that we see in politics have been funding this whole push, and it's at a sort of a different two-level, area of emphasis. One, they've been funding a bunch of stuff at the state levels to encourage states to demand that the public lands, the federal lands, our national lands in those states be turned over to the states. And that is coming through, there's a variety of these groups. Something called the American Legislative Exchange Council has been, writing all the bills that are being pushed in these western states. And really the purpose behind that is to, rally public support for this notion of getting rid of federal lands, and to basically give cover then to federal politicians in D.C., who are the only ones that can transfer that land. I mean, Utah can demand as much as it wants that the feds turn over the land in that state. There's not going to happen without an act of Congress. So really these state efforts were designed, and something called the American Lands Council is out there pushing this and has a multi-million-dollar budget to lobby both state legislatures as well as the federal government on this very issue. And their whole goal is to make this thing mainstream, because it sounds like a kooky idea, but it's much more coordinated. There's a lot more money behind it, and they're making a much more serious effort with it. I mean, to wit, in the year before last, Congress passed the U.S. Senate, and Senator Lisa Murkowski, the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, proposed a non-binding resolution that ought to be the federal government's policy to transfer or sell off all of the lands that are not national parks and national monuments. And it passed in the U.S. Senate. So, I mean, this is no longer just a kooky idea that has no legs. And we see that things like this, and then the Cliven Bundy fiasco back in Nevada, where he just hasn't been paying any of his grazing fees, owes over $1 million to the federal government, decides to make it this cause about freedom. And a bunch of the very sort of right-wing politicians embrace that, which then leads his son to do this takeover of the refuge in Oregon. So I think these are all related. I think each one is a sort of step up from the last. The idea is to sow discontent out there and to give cover to the federal politicians to make this happen.
So there's a lot of questions I have in here, or things I've heard talked about that I think people have common questions about. But I want to make one point, and it comes down to the fact that topics like this so often become politicized. You know, like you mentioned, one aspect of this, you know, we'll see far right, and they're saying, well, this is a conservative issue. This is something that if you were conservative, you would support X. And then the other side, there's people saying, well, no, if you don't support this, you're super liberal or blah, 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 blah. And I think that the topic of public lands, and this is something that I'm not coming up with this is something I've heard Randy Newberg say a lot. And every time I hear him say it, I'm just like, yeah, hallelujah. Topics like this, like public lands, you mentioned there's, 50% of hunters either hunt part of the time or all the time on public lands. If we don't have access to this land, we can't do what we love to do. This is a hunting issue. This is a hunter and angler issue. This isn't a Democratic issue. This isn't a Republican issue. This isn't a far right or far left issue. This is a you and me. This is a you and me thing. And so
I would argue this is a fundamentally American issue. I mean, you think about, go ahead and go to England and try to do a hunt. And the only way you're going to do it is if you can pay the money to go on some private preserve someplace and shoot, basically tame animals. And, our system here, the whole North American model of, wildlife conservation is grounded in that hunting and fishing are something that everybody can do. And if we don't have the opportunity to do that on our public lands, that's a very shallow, hollow thing. And, so I think I think this is about as American as you can get. And it's been supported by Republicans and Democrats, and that expansion, the public land system we have, has been expanded by, Ronald Reagan, by Richard Nixon. I mean, all these folks who are not necessarily thought of as great environmentalists, they were really good when it came to a lot of these public lands issues. And, they are, as are Democrats as well. So this is the one issue, conservation, hunting and fishing, public lands, that has never been a partisan issue.
Yeah.
And it's, it's in some people's interest to make it a partisan issue today, but it certainly shouldn't be.
What are the gains for those lobbyists and those people who want those lands turned over to the state? What is the gain of that?
Well, let's think about it. So, all right, let's say all the land in Utah or Nevada gets turned over to that state. Then the state has the ability to, do a couple things with it. It can, manage exactly the way the Fed's managing right now, but the fact is they would never be able to afford to do that. So they won't be able to afford the firefighting costs alone in those lands. So then they have a couple of choices. They can either raise taxes to pay for the management of those lands, or they can lease them out to industry and generate profit, or they can sell them outright. Now, all the states were granted a whole bunch of lands as a part of statehood. Almost all of those states have sold those lands off. So I think we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. They're not going to be raising taxes on their citizens to maintain these lands. They're either going to develop them or they're going to sell them off. And that benefits the folks that can either buy them or can make money off them.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but don't most state governments have an obligation, if there's state-owned land, the obligation is to manage that for profit to support various school systems and things like that within the state budget? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So state trust lands in Arizona and Wyoming and a bunch of the other western states, you can't hunt on them, you can't fish on them, you can't hike on them, you can't camp on them. They are solely for the purpose of generating revenue, and that means they've been leased out to somebody else. So, listen, the states want to do that, that's their right to do it with their lands. But I don't see that with America's national lands, our public lands, yours and mine, I don't see that you ought to have the right to do that.
Right, and then also with federal lands, right? Most of these ordinances or these groups that whether it be the BLM or the National Forest Service, etc., they are mandated to manage to certain other goals, which are not necessarily to be profitable, but to protect wildlife habitat or to follow various other conservation mandates. So we have certain conservation requirements when it's managed by the federal government, which is good for hunting, which is good for fishing,
That's exactly
which is
right.
good for access.
You're exactly right. I mean, the Park Service is the only one that does not have a, quote, multiple use mandate. By multiple use means the national forests, the BLM lands, the wildlife refuges even, have got to balance multiple uses. It could be oil and gas development, logging, grazing. That can all be done, just fine. I mean, it requires people sitting down, working together. And actually, the irony of these guys deciding to take over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is that's been a poster child for cooperative management between the local landowners and the refuge. And this is, the whole issue that these guys came in here complaining about, which is the two guys getting thrown in jail, has nothing to do, with grazing on the refuge or anything like that. I mean, so it's really ironic. This is one of those sort of classic cases where everyone's gotten together, they worked out a system that works for everybody, and now they're being, taken over as a, symbol of, federal injustice. So no, you're exactly right. I mean, multiple use means that it's up to us as hunters, as citizens, to participate in the process and to make sure that, hunting and fish and wildlife get taken care of, as well as grazing and timber and mining. And but that's not going to happen when it goes to the states.
Yeah. So if I had to sum this all up, because people have all these questions about this. They ask, well, why would it be a bad thing for the state to have the land, or why wouldn't we want to sell some of these lands? All these different things. If I had to kind of put it all into a nice little package, and I'm going to give you my best attempt at a kind of soundbite, and then you tell me if I need to correct anything. But it sounds like, right, there is this push by certain groups or people. They want federal lands transferred to state agencies, because when this land is owned and controlled by the federal government, there's these multiple use mandates, which are good for hunting and fishing, but are bad for people that want to make money, maybe. So if these lands go to the state government is then mandated to have to manage those lands for profit. So all of a sudden, these landscapes might become more available to extractive industries or to be sold off to development or whatever it might be. So that is good for people, like you said, who want to make money off these lands, but it's bad for people who want to use these lands right now, which are managed for access, hunting, fishing, wildlife habitat, etc. at a super high level. Is that the Cliff Notes version of this issue?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is not to say that there are not problems with federal land management. There are. I mean, everyone gets frustrated with something, but there is a public process to go through to deal with those disputes. I mean, every single unit out there has a land management plan, has a public process that guides management on that unit. And it's up to us to engage. We don't like something, don't go take it over. Engage in the process and try to have things fixed. And that is the real lesson here. But I think the bottom line is we know what we get when we have federal lands or public lands, national lands, and that is they're always going to be there for future generations to enjoy, just the way they have been since the 1908. And I have zero confidence that those lands will be there if they get transferred to the states.
Yeah. So is there anything that I can do or that our listeners can do? Is there anything that an individual can do to help on this issue?
Absolutely. You can go to www.sportsmansaccess.org, and we've been running a petition there with a bunch of our partner organizations and companies that basically sends letters to members of Congress, depending on where you live, and your local representatives. It basically says, the federal lands are important for us. Don't get rid of them. And we have about 25,000 signatures on that petition right now. We've sent over 200,000 letters. And the more the merrier, and I would encourage everybody to do that. And frankly, it's already working. There were 37 bills introduced in 11 state legislatures last year to demand transfer of the public lands. Only, I think it was 6 of those passed, and 4 of them were let's study the issue more bills. So we had Sportsmen with Us, National Wildlife Federation, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. We held rallies at state capitals in Montana, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico. And, the sportsmen, really more than any other constituency, spoke up and said, basically, not over our dead bodies you're going to be doing this. And those legislatures, they got the message pretty darn quickly. But, if we're quiet, if we don't stay engaged in this issue, it's just a matter of time before it pops back up and we're going to be in a worse situation.
Yeah, and if something like that ever happened, or some type of mandate got pushed through Congress where they start actually transferring these public lands away from the federal government, I mean, I can't imagine a worse scenario for hunting and fishing in this country, because like you said, it's a massive amount of land that's so unique to America that we have access to. It's your land, it's our land. This is for us. And if we lost that, I can't imagine a more dire doomsday scenario for my children and our grandchildren than that to happen. So that scares the crap out of me, and I really want to make sure this is something that everyone listening, this is one of the biggest issues I think out there from everything I understand and from who I've talked to. So please take Whit's recommendation. Go to sportsmanaccess.org, fill out, sign the petition, send letters to your congressmen and women. This is one of those things that your action can make a difference, I think, in that way. And don't just think about it. This is something for me too. I always hear something like, yeah, that's an issue that I get fired up about, or this is an important issue, but then I'm driving and then I don't remember when I get home to do something about it, or the next week I forget that I need to send a letter or send an email. I think personally that this is one of those issues that you really need to take a note right now, right in your finger, right in your hand, not your finger, right in your hand or a piece of paper to do this. I think it's worthwhile. So for whatever that's worth. Speaking of access then, you had mentioned that there's some other sportsman-related access issues that are of importance, like maybe the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or you mentioned some of the different things going on opening up private land for hunting. This is a big thing for deer hunters especially, especially in the East Coast or Midwest, where it's getting harder and harder and harder to find places to hunt.
Yep.
Tell us more about this. What's going on nationally when it comes to access? But before we hear from Whit on access, we need to take a quick break for a word from one of our partners, Bear Archery, who's a sponsor of this podcast episode. I've been shooting bear bow for a number of years now, and one of the coolest things about this company is its history, specifically the fact that it was founded by Fred Bear. And if you're a little on the younger side and you're maybe not familiar with Fred Bear, he is someone you really need to take a little bit of time to learn about. He's an absolute legend. Do a little reading, watch some of his videos. Quite simply, he's just an amazing figure in the history of bow hunting and hunting in general. So, with that said, I thought over the course of the next couple weeks, we could share a few wise words from the founder of Bear Archery, Mr. Fred Bear. So today, I thought we'd start with these words, and I quote, "I have always tempered my killing with respect for the game pursued. I see the animal not only as a target, but as a living creature, with more freedom than I will ever have. I take that life, if I can, with regret as well as joy, and with the sure knowledge that nature's way of fang and claw and starvation are a far crueler fate than I bestow." End quote. If you'd like to learn more about Fred Bear or Bear Archery, visit beararchery.com. And now here's Whit on the topic of access.
Yeah, my main passion is deer hunting, is whitetail hunting as well. So this is one that is sort of near and dear to my heart. And listen, most of us who live in the eastern United States are going to be hunting on private lands. And if you look at what's happening in Washington D.C., where 30 years ago you could drive half an hour outside of town and there'd be wide open farmlands, and anybody would let you on there, and there were bobwhite quail around D.C. and it was great hunting and fishing. The suburbs have now sprawled out so far that we just don't see that. And where you do have open lands, you're very lucky if you can get a landowner to give you permission to get on there. And, so we're just seeing this changing demographic in the West. What we're seeing is, you have big blocks of public lands, but, then you have the lower, more productive, bottom areas. Those tend to be private lands. And the old ranching family never minded people would cut through his property to get up to access the national forest. But when it gets bought by some, rich California dude, he immediately puts up the no trespassing signs and blocks the old gate. So we're losing access to our public lands. We're losing access to private lands. And really, there's not much we can do about it. It's private land. The landowner can do what they want with it. But let's give them some incentives to do the right thing and to keep the public on it. So in the 90, I'm trying to think which farm bill it was. That was actually in the mid-2000s, we created a program called Open Fields, a voluntary public access program in the Farm Bill, which provided incentives to landowners to open up their fields for hunting and fishing. And what it would do is not only give them a payment to do that, but it would also waive them any sort of liability. So if some guy fell in a ditch and broke his leg, he's not going to sue the landowner. So the state assumed that liability. It's a grant program to the states, and after the first farm bill when it came in, it added about 3 million acres of private lands to public access. It was renewed and expanded in the most recent farm bill that passed 2 years ago, and we're fairly confident that it will add even more than that this time around. And this program exists because the landowners like it, and sportsmen like us, as well as bird watchers and others, they like it too. And so the states administer it, so there's the folks that are the locals are used to dealing with their state governments. There's no issue of the feds coming in and taking over their properties or anything like that. So it's a really good program, and we want to make sure it gets expanded and works well. And it's called a Voluntary Public Access Habitat Improvement Program administered by Department of Agriculture. So that's something that we want to make sure is working, gets expanded.
Is that sorry?
I
was just going to say, is that a controversial issue at all? Is there anyone who's opposed to that kind of program, or is this something that just needs to be brought to more people's attention?
It needs to be brought to more people's attention. You need to make sure you tell your lawmakers. I mean, listen, your Senator Debbie Stabenow was critical in expanding this. And when you're at a meeting with her or anybody else, just say, "Hey, great job! This is a great program. I hunted this area here; it was fabulous." But also work with your state agencies to make sure that they're really aggressively putting in the program. We don't want them developing access easements on nukes ground that doesn't have any fish and wildlife on there. And if there is that, get back to your agency and say, "Hey, you know what? This is not very good, and we're kind of wasting our money on this one."
Is this program? Is this it sounds like it's being administered by the Department of Agriculture you mentioned. Is this responsible for some of these state access programs? Like I know in Kansas and North Dakota, states like that, they have walk-in hunting access programs. Is that a part of this, or are those something separate that the state puts on?
It's something similar. It's actually, they're the same things. So the federal program exists to encourage the states to create those block grant walk-in programs. And actually, Kansas is one of the first states that did this, and it was so popular in Kansas that local counties were giving the states grants to basically expand, do this program in their counties, because they saw what it did to, the hunters were coming in and using that, what that did to local hotels and restaurants and all the rest. So it's very related to that. This is an opportunity to expand it in the states that already have those programs, or to create those programs in some of the states that didn't have them. I mean, some of the big recipients of this last round that was announced over the summer were places like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, which are kind of starved when it comes to the public lands.
Yeah, I'd love to see that happen more in those types of states, or here in Michigan or anywhere where there's such a high density of hunters, and like you said, limited public land access and private access is just dwindling drastically. So gosh, I would love to see that type of program expand. And it sounds like the most places that I hear about it are in those states like Kansas, North Dakota, farther west, where there's a little more availability, where it might be needed even more in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, New York, etc. So I hope that's something that continues to gain momentum. Yeah,
I think so. And the hunters out there ought to figure out where those areas are and use them. Or if they're not going to use them, at least pat your local state government on the back for opening them up to people.
Yeah. Dan, do you have programs like that in Iowa?
I don't think we have. I know I think Nebraska or South Dakota have, if it's not posted, it's fair game type of, if you have 200 acres and you don't put no trespassing sign or stay off this property sign, then it's free game for whoever wants to hunt it. But Iowa, I don't think has a program like that.
Gotcha. Well, you got to start talking to your lawmakers. I need some more access when I come visit.
We could also use some more money from Congress, because I think literally as much as Congress is willing to appropriate, the states will use and buy access for us. And it's important to note too, this is good for conservation also, because the areas that if a landowner wants to enroll in this program, they get higher scoring if they are enrolled in conservation programs like CRP or some of those things. That really so it makes it a double win. It's encouraging them to do conservation, and it's providing hunting and fishing access.
Right. It all comes down to incentivizing landowners, and if you can make it worthwhile for them, when if they have a financial incentive to do something that's good for conservation, that's a good thing, because otherwise, they might do what's good from a money standpoint in a way that's not so good for deer, pheasants, whatever it might be. So I think this is a perfect example of finding ways to find win-win situations, which is probably the only way that we're going to get things done towards these types of goals. So,
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And this has been a really good program, and it's something that Secretary Vilsack, who's the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, really likes. He's an Iowa guy.
He's from my hometown.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Mount
No, he
Pleasant.
loves this program, so it's great.
wow, very good.
But I mean, just you look at this year. I'm just pulling it up on my computer while we're talking. Massachusetts got $836,000 grant to expand or create this program there. Nebraska got $1.35 million. Oklahoma $1.5 million. And so we're talking real money.
Yeah.
Connecticut was $612,000. Which probably doesn't buy a lot in Connecticut, but it's better than nothing. Illinois over $500,000. Kansas $2.7 million. So it's real money, and it's a great program.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that kind of thing is happening, because this issue of access is becoming one of the absolute keystone issues for deer hunters, especially east of the Mississippi River, where it's just getting really hard to find places. I think there was a recent survey a couple of years ago by the National Shooting Sports Foundation, I believe, that asked, why do you not hunt anymore, or why did you never get into hunting? And by far, the most popular response was lack of somewhere to hunt. So if we're concerned about getting new hunters into our ranks and building our hunting family, this is something that is right up there at the top of the list if we ever want to increase, let alone see our numbers continue to decrease. So,
no, you're exactly right. And that was the whole rationale behind putting this program in place in the first place. And we're trying to sort of create this sort of stack of things that make, give you incentives for landowners to do the right thing with their land. So, yeah, they get a payment for CRP, they can get a payment for other things, they get a payment for this. So all of a sudden, it's great for the landowner too.
Yeah. So speaking of access and land, then, an acronym that's been thrown a lot. It's been thrown around a lot over the last couple months, last half a year maybe or so, and maybe some people listening have heard it but haven't known really why it's important. Is LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Can you fill us in on what that is, what's been going on recently with it, and why it's important for hunters and anglers?
Yeah, so the Land and Water Conservation Fund was created 50 years ago, 51 years ago now. And it was a deal that was struck when they were trying to do oil and gas development in the Outer Continental Shelf. And they decided, okay, fine, we'll allow development in the Outer Continental Shelf. This is Congress, and, I think it was, whatever the president was then, Kennedy or Johnson, I guess Johnson. And the deal was, but we're going to require the oil and gas companies to pay into this fund called the Land and Water Conservation Fund that will basically, will develop a non-renewable resource and will protect renewable resources. And so basically every year, $900 million from oil and gas receipts get deposited into this account, and then it gets appropriated by Congress, to two different things. One, to the agencies to do land acquisition or easement. So Fish and Wildlife Service may expand a refuge or may buy a conservation easement adjacent to a refuge, that's good for hunting and fishing. And then the other part of it goes to the state agencies that may build ball fields or parks in urban areas. So it really is one of these programs that benefits both, urban users as well as, fish and wildlife and rural users. The problem is that even though that money is being paid for by the oil and gas companies, it goes into this fund every year. It basically routinely, only once in the 50 years it's been around, has Congress actually kicked the whole $900 million out. Instead, Congress, provides anywhere from $200 million to $400 million, something like that, and then the rest just goes to deficit reduction. So what we've been yelling about is, one, this is a dedicated source of funding that's supposed to be paying for conservation. We ought to be using it for what it was intended for, which is conservation. And then, two is the program expired this past year, so we were trying to get Congress to reauthorize it. Now, Congress doesn't get around to reauthorizing a whole bunch of programs. The Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, things like that haven't been reauthorized in years. But when it's not reauthorized, it makes it much harder to get money into it. So the real fear that we were seeing is that this is a program that's never been fully funded to begin with, and it's going to get even more hampered if it didn't get reauthorized. So in the budget deal that got cut at the end of the year, we got a 3-year extension on the authorization and $450 million in funding for this year and next year, which is great because that's way more than we've been getting in the past. So, and it really, sportsmen were pivotal in this thing. I mean, a lot of folks sort of consider this the program that really benefits the environmental community more broadly, but I think it was really our community that pushed this thing over the edge. We produced a report in 2015 that really talked about the impact this fund has had on sportsmen in terms of access projects. And, by changing, I think, the terms of that debate, I think we were really able to expand that coalition and make it much more palatable for particularly some of the Republican folks who legitimately say, well, we're having a hard time taking care of our public lands anyway. Why do we want to keep adding more to them? And I think our community was able to go in there and say, first of all, this doesn't make it more expensive to manage lands. I mean, think about in the West, we have these checkerboard patterns of land ownership, public and private and public and private. A lot of what this does is buy out in-holdings and really consolidates federal lands and makes it easier and cheaper to manage. Second, it also can be used, and about half the money is being used right now for easements. So instead of buying land, we're just going into a landowner and encouraging them to do the right thing, maybe for a species, maybe for a sportsman, for access. And that's a great use of this program too. And actually, your money goes a lot further when you're doing these working landscape type easements as opposed to an outright acquisition.
Can you?
And then, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you elaborate a little bit on conservation easements? Because that's something I think that some people maybe don't know a whole lot about or hear it, and they don't know exactly what it means. And it's something that I think, is popping up more and more really across the country and benefits a lot of us deer hunters, even, on the eastern side of the country. So what exactly are those? How do you go about getting one? What's it do?
What you're essentially doing is you're relinquishing your development rights, either for a tax benefit or for an outright payment. And for example, I've got a small woodlot in upstate New York that I grew up on, and we have about 90% of that in a conservation easement, and it reduces our taxes. And frankly, my brother and I, we don't ever want that land developed. So it's beneficial to how we want to manage that property long term. And so it's a great way to use an incentive for private landowners to conserve land in perpetuity.
So if you have, let's say, we've got a family farm that we absolutely love, and it's been a place that our entire family has learned to hunt and has had incredible memories, and we want to protect that for animals and wildlife and future generations to enjoy that natural aspect of it. I can go ahead and put that property into a conservation easement, and that means that I can know for sure that even after I die, that's not going to be turned into a parking lot. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's exactly right. And you can either get the benefit in an outright, cash payment from somebody, like a Landowner Conservation Fund grant, or just as a benefit or as a reduction in your taxes over time. So it may reduce your taxes, 25%, 40%, 50%, because you're basically relinquishing all your development rights, which makes that land less worthwhile from a development perspective. Yeah. So, no, it's a great program. In fact, we just got permanently extended. That's another program that ran out in 2015, which is this the permanent conservation tax easements, the incentive program, and we got that right at the end of the year extended as well, permanently. So that will always be a part of the tax code now.
I think that's a pretty cool thing, especially for folks here who lots of times we think, at least I kind of think sometimes here in the Midwest, it just doesn't feel like there's many opportunities to protect large pieces of land or really to make a difference when it comes to landscapes because of the fact that it's so much more developed, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a case where an individual really can make a difference. You can actually help set aside a piece of ground that can be great habitat for deer or whatever wildlife might be there for a long time to come. So that's kind of a really neat way for a single person to make a long-lasting impact.
That's exactly right. And you can dictate the terms of what you can and can't do on your land. So, for example, on our place, we have in upstate New York, we do timber harvest. We can go in and do all the wildlife treatments and things like that. But what we just can't do is develop new houses on it.
Yeah.
So we don't want to do anyway.
Right.
Does that also mean that you allow other hunters to hunt that property?
Nope, not unless we wanted to. I mean, the state could have offered to buy an easement access from us. We didn't have any interest in that. We're surrounded sort of by state land up there, so there's plenty of state access around us. But that would have to be just a term of the deal you worked out with the state or whoever's holding the easement. Nature Conservancy, groups like that can hold an easement, as well as your state Fish and Wildlife Agency.
And you can make sure, let's say hypothetically, no, I guess in most cases, right, if you had a conservation easement, that would remain true even if your land after you died was sold to someone else or anything, right? It stays in perpetuity. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, it goes with the land.
Okay, interesting stuff. So when it comes to the LWCF, which does help fund a lot of things like that, and you mentioned it's been reauthorized for several years now, is there anything that we hunters need to be keeping tabs on or paying attention to or pushing still, or is this something that we can say, okay, check it off the box, it's good to go, we don't need to worry about it?
You can. It's not an immediate crisis, but it's given the fact that we only got a 3-year extension on this, as opposed to the permanent reauthorization we wanted. It's always going to be a fight. And then also we got funding locked in for the next 2 years, but then after that, who knows? And it's really incumbent on our community not to assume that this stuff goes on without us, but to engage and participate when it comes time to yell at Congress, make sure they're funding it, to make sure they're reauthorizing these programs, things like that. Because if we're not speaking up, either nobody's going to, or people we don't want to have representing us are going to be doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
On some of these issues, you mentioned this earlier, kind of like the corporate America, the companies that support hunters, like an archery company or a tree stand company or any Cabela's, Bass Pro Shops, and stuff like that. And there's also the term "money talks, BS walks" kind of mentality. How much of this corporate America is actually their funds actually helping this movement?
Well, the hunting and fishing community does not have the deep pockets, with the exception of a Cabela's or Bass Pro or a couple other industries or companies that some of the big oil and gas or developers or things like that have. So we're relatively small potatoes because we're so diffuse and there's so many little mom and pop sporting goods shops and things like that. So while we are a really significant industry economically as an aggregate, our individual members, really don't engage all that much in that significant way, which is always going to put us on the defensive, which is why we need people to stick up for us, because we're never going to be able to match, from a money standpoint, some of these bigger companies. Now, that said, there are, oil and gas companies, there are timber companies that are really good stewards and really want to do the right thing and see that doing the right thing is not only a good thing to do, but actually helps them from a business standpoint. Because it creates some certainty. They know where they can go, they know where they can't go, and they know what the rules are. And as long as they know what the rules, they're happy to play by them. But it's when the goalposts are constantly shifting, they have problems. So, I mentioned Schlumberger is a supporter of ours. Potlatch, Plum Creek. These guys, which are not exactly sort of commonly associated with environmental stuff, they're really good on these issues.
So what you're saying, I think, is that there are ways for these two constituencies to find ways to work together, right? Because you look at there's extraction-related industries like timber, oil and gas, et cetera, that sometimes I think I even have the tendency to look at and say, lots of times that's hurting our habitats, that's hurting our hunting and fishing opportunities, et cetera. But maybe there's more recently we're finding ways for those groups to find win-wins again. There's ways that we can still use the land for profit, but also do it in such a way that it can be still productive for habitat and wildlife.
Absolutely. So, let's use the example of timber harvest. You have groups like Plum Creek or Potlatch, which are major timber producers. Listen, a lot of our forests will benefit from some management. Whitetail hunters know that. A little bit of early successional habitat is great. But that's even true for elk. It's true for mule deer some. You like having that mosaic of habitat. You don't want the place mowed to the ground. But at the same time, you don't want it all just standing there and burning with no management at all. So, that's a place where we can find common ground with the timber companies. And they know that. I think we understand that. And again, it's that sort of sensible center, that I think our community has always represented.
Yeah, and that's the challenge is getting people to come to that middle where we can find ways that can work for everyone, or at least make a positive step. So speaking of, you mentioned fire. I know that forest management and firefighting, forest fires, has been a big topic, but I wonder if some people don't necessarily understand how that really impacts hunting and fishing and larger issues across the country. Can you kind of explain why this whole fire funding issue and forest management is something that we all need to be aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes back to this is primarily an issue on the public lands. So we have it's primarily an issue on the national forest system, which is about 192 million acres, and fire has always been a part of the ecosystem, especially out west. But 20 years ago, the agency was spending about 16% of its budget fighting fires. Now it's up spending more than 50% of its budget fighting fires. And as a result, it is doing precious little else than fighting these huge fires. It is not managing wildlife habitat. It is not clearing areas around the urban forest interface, which are really very prone to fires. It is not doing, pretty much anything. It's not managing its campgrounds. Forest Service has had, I think, 2,000, sort of developed campgrounds they've had to shut down in the last few years. They don't have the money to operate them anymore because they're spending it all on damn fighting fires. So the way natural disasters are handled in every other situation in this country, tornadoes, hurricanes, anything like that, is that, the majority of those costs come out of, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, and emergency funds. So what we're trying to do is fire is always going to be a part of the Forest Service's responsibilities, and it's going to be part of their budget. But as you get above, a certain level, then let's tap some of these emergency funds and not have the agency basically keep cannibalizing itself, which prevents it from doing everything else it needs to do. And, that was one big frustration. We had a very good budget deal at the end of the year, which was actually very good for conservation almost across the board, with the exception of fixing this fire funding stuff. And until we can fix this, we're going to continue to have major problems of management on the national forest system, which then feeds the discontent for the people who really ticked off at the federal agencies and how they're managing our public lands. But it's not necessarily the agency's fault because they're so hamstrung with their budgets.
Right. So this issue with the fire funding ultimately could negatively impact the larger debate around whether or not we should have public lands and if they're going to be managed by the federal government, which is good for hunting and fishing and all those things. So even though I think a lot of people assume, and it's understandable, that this fire issue is a Western thing, right? I don't see massive forest fires here in Michigan, but regardless, this is something that could impact my ability to have access to public lands, whether it be out west or here on the East Coast or Midwest or anything. These things are all tied together. And I think also...
Well, it is directly an issue in Michigan, not because you're going to get the fires, but because the management is supposed to be happening on the Manistee, Huron, whatever national forest it may be, is being taken to fund fires in Idaho.
Exactly.
So, it is impacting land managers in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont and the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. It is affecting you guys in Michigan, the Wayne National Forest in Ohio. I mean, it is impacting every single national forest out there, whether folks know it or not.
Yeah. It's one of those things that could easily, I don't think most people, I wouldn't have known this unless I'd read some of these things that how that funding mechanism works, and the fact that it's taking away so much of what the Forest Service should be doing in Ohio, Michigan, etc. So,
right.
And again, and this is an assumption on my part, but is it true that really on this front again comes down to communicating with our legislators and saying, hey, this is an important thing? Is there anything that's happening still? You mentioned that this wasn't passed in the most recent spending bill. Is there any action being taken to try to change things?
Oh, yeah. No, it's our top priority. This year, I know it's Secretary Vilsack's top priority to get this thing fixed because, it is the one big miss that we had last year. And we just need to get this fixed or else it's just going to continue to snowball and cannibalize that agency. And I think there is broad bipartisan support to fix this in Congress. Republicans, Democrats, people get it. They understand what it's doing. But just some sort of last-minute shenanigans, in Congress prevented this from happening. Speaker Ryan supported this, getting fixed, but it just didn't get done for the last second. So I think that we're all going to be working very hard to make sure this gets done and gets done quickly, recognizing that not a lot gets done in an election year.
Okay, fair enough. So I kind of want to move now to, while the last couple things we talked about might be indirectly related to the core deer hunter's daily life, this is a topic that I think, especially anyone who hunts in the Midwest, this is something that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts, and that's CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. This is something that provides and funds habitat that a lot of us love to hunt for deer. It's tremendous habitat for deer, but to your point, which I think you made 20, 30 minutes ago, it's something that's we're rapidly losing it. Can you elaborate on what's going on with the CRP program right now?
Well, let's take a little history just to explain to listeners just why CRP was created in the first place. So it was created back in the 80s as really a farm safety net program. I mean, commodity prices were really crappy. Farmers were having a very hard time. This is a way to give them some funds for not planting some areas, and it was good for wildlife too. And really, it has sort of grown from that idea, which is just sort of helping the farmers out, survive these tough periods, to really an indispensable program if you like to hunt and fish, and you like clean water and butterflies and all the rest. But since CRP had about 30, almost 37 million acres enrolled back in 2007. The new Farm Bill that was passed kicks that down to about 24 million acres. That is a huge reduction. The Farm Bill created some other conservation programs to sort of take its place, but I think that we're still pushing to try to get that cap back up. And you can look at some of the historical numbers with what happens when you reduce CRP funding in terms of hunting populations. I'm looking at a stat right now. The CRP was reduced by about 5.5 million acres between 2006 and 2012. And remarkably, pheasant populations simultaneously dropped by about half, from 5.7 million birds to 2.9 million birds.
Wow.
So there is a direct one-to-one correlation between certainly pheasants and CRP, but also a whole lot of other species.
Yeah, I think we talked with Kip Adams from the Quality Deer Management Association last January, and he'd been looking into this issue and how it pertains to whitetail deer populations, and how we've been seeing massive reductions in populations and harvest numbers in states like Iowa, where you're seeing this huge loss of habitat because of CRP going out. So I think it's something that's definitely impacting deer too, especially in these states where CRP provides some of your only or best whitetail habitat when everything else is in crops if it's not in CRP. So
and Iowa is a poster child of they have wall-to-wall crops, and these good years where we had high crop prices, and it has devastated the pheasant population, it's devastated the deer population, and we're sort of on the same track in South Dakota, but we got a lot more enrolled there. So no, this is a huge issue, and it's a huge issue, across a bunch of the Corn Belt near where you guys live.
Yeah.
So this CRP, the reduction in the CRP funding, does that mean that the landowners are getting less money per acre for their CRP dollars, or is the government not renewing contracts?
No, there's actually an acreage cap associated with the Farm Bill. So right now, USDA is not allowed to enroll more than 24 million acres in the program. The farmers are still getting their money. In fact, they're probably getting more money because, they're not that high right now, but when corn and, soybean prices were higher, they were getting, you had to provide them more money to be competitive, with commodity prices. But, no, it's an acreage cap, and we're trying to get that acreage cap kicked back up to get more, land enrolled, particularly now that commodity prices are down. So now it's actually in the farmer's interest to enroll more land into CRP as opposed to just wall-to-wall, row crops.
And hypothetically, in the past, when it was, the cap was 37 million acres or something like that, now that's only 24. Is it possible that there could be people that currently have ground in CRP that when it comes back up for renewal, they're going to be told, no, we can't renew it because our cap is met in this area or whatever it might be. And so we're going to see ground that used to be in CRP that we used to be able to hunt that all of a sudden now it's not going to make the cap.
Yeah, that's definitely a possible scenario. Another scenario is just when their 10-year enrollment's up, they just take it out because they think they can make more money, growing corn.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of deer hunters need to be worried about, and this is one to pay particular attention to because, as we said, I mean, that's some of your most productive ground for deer, that early successional habitat, the grassy, it's terrific bedding cover. I don't know if any of you have hunted in or near CRP, but that makes for some of the absolute best places to observe deer and for deer to feel safe and comfortable in those types of habitats. And then, of course, as you mentioned, pheasants, all sorts of upland bird species, everything I think benefits from that type of ground.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're really seeing now is that the pollinators, the butterflies, things like that, are really dependent, on those CRP lands. And when they go, so go to the pollinators, which has direct impact on our crops.
Yeah.
Now, I come from a farming family. Both of my grandparents farmed. So you're asking, and I'm going to play a little devil's advocate, and I'm going to ask you kind of a hypothetical question. You're asking a farmer, they want to renew it into the CRP program. There's going to be a potential that the CRP program is not going to be there for these farmers to do. So they want to make money off their land somehow. So they're going to turn it into crops, or they're going to turn it into grazing lands, or whatever they're going to do with it. They want to make money for their family. Is there something you could tell a farmer if they don't get that renewal, or they don't get it, to say, hey, we don't want you to farm all your land or graze all your land. You're not going to make money off of it, but you're going to be doing what is right for conservation.
Oh, sure. I mean, any groups like Pheasants Forever, their local chapters are having those discussions with farmers, probably every day. But it's awfully nice to, farming, as they need to do it to make money. I mean, it's not a charity, and they're, it's tough for them to just sort of set aside acres, for just because it's the right thing to do. And if we can provide, some money through CRP for them in a 10-year contract, we can give them some additional money, maybe for a open fields grant to allow folks to hunt and fish. Those are the type of things that, I think, pheasants, I use them as just an example because they have all these sort of young farm bill biologists out there working with landowners to figure out the different payment, mechanisms they could put together to make it worthwhile to keep this in wildlife habitat.
Is there anything, I guess I'm not sure when the next farm bill comes out, or when people start working that again, but is there anything happening right now to try to actively increase that cap, or is there anything, is this one of those issues again? Is this like a high priority item right now for individuals?
Yeah, no, it is a high priority item. In fact, we're advocating to try to kick that cap up to 30 million. 30 and 30, 30th anniversary, let's kick it up to 30 million and try to get that up there. So it's it can be done, and I think this is a program that is popular enough among all stripes of people. But again, it's just it's a tough year to get anything done, and we need some clamoring from our hunting and fishing friends to get it done.
Okay, so basically, we need to make some noise. Is that right?
Make some noise, baby.
All right, that is something that me and Dan are pretty good at. So one of the few things. So we'll do our best.
And if anybody has questions about this, one woman who runs our ag program, Ariel Wiegard, is really good on this subject, and you can just call here the TRCP office or email her at awiegard at trcp.org, and she can get you the information. Her contact information is also on our website, www.trcp.org.
Awesome. We'll definitely have to take a look at that. Excuse me. Now, I want to touch on another topic that you didn't necessarily mention at the beginning, but at least I think is on the minds of a lot of deer hunters today. And I'm not sure if this is a larger conservation issue that's being talked about at the federal level or not. Maybe it's just in the deer community, but I'm curious to hear from you. Is there anything going on when it comes to diseases like CWD, like chronic wasting disease? This is something that within the deer community we're talking about a lot. We're talking about in relation to the high fence industry and how that ties into disease issues. Is there anything going on at the highest levels that you guys are working on when it comes to these types of things and how it's impacting deer issues and things along those lines? Yeah,
I think it's a very timely subject, and really more this is primarily a state issue as opposed to a federal issue. But yeah, there's stuff that feds could and should be doing. I mean, Department of Agriculture has, in my mind, and again, Kip Adams at QDMA, and some of those guys are far greater experts than I am, but they have been way too accommodating to, try to, they see this as, an agriculture issue, like cattle. Like, how do we maximize profit and make it so this can be done profitably for people who want to do it? Be it, growing, meat for, the Venice market, or, big deer to be, sold off to stud. And, I think that, in my mind, deer are not and never should be a commodity. They're special. And they're not going to be cows, and they shouldn't be treated like cows. And the state agencies, we would really like to see them managed under, by the Fish and Wildlife departments and not the agriculture departments. And we would love to see USDA show a little more backbone here to try to make sure that, what is an incredible resource in this country, which is white-tailed deer, mule deer, and is not, screwed up by this, because it's just a matter of time before CWD spreads everywhere, especially if the agriculture guys are controlled. At least that's my personal opinion.
Yeah. Is this getting any play at the higher levels? Are conversations being had, when it comes to this in, departments such as the USDA or anything like that? Or is it really just a lot of fighting going on at the state level?
Well, I think this is going to change. And, you're obviously aware, of the whole creation of this new National Deer Alliance. Mm-hmm. And, Mark, I think you've been involved with it.
Yeah.
And this is the first time where the sort of deer community has sort of linked arms to speak in a single voice on these big issues. And I think this is going to be, if not the biggest issue, certainly one of the biggest issues that the Alliance takes on. And I think we're eager to help the Alliance, but I think I'm thrilled to see that the community has finally sort of gotten together and decided to work together, as opposed to sort of a variety of different smaller entities.
Yeah, I think to your point at the very beginning of the show, there's been such a segmented approach to conservation or some of these other issues within the hunting and fishing community. It's this species, that species, or this state and that state. And I think more and more today, to make any forward progress, we need to start coming together and speaking with one single voice as best as possible, because our influence our influence is shrinking probably unless we don't do that. So,
yep, totally agree.
Moving
because the folks that stand to benefit financially from captive deer, they're pretty darn organized, and we need to get organized as well.
Right. So now I'm kind of jumping around here, but I've taken some notes here on a couple things that I want to make sure that we kind of answer some questions about, because CWD has been a hot issue over the last year, but another really hot issue has been the sage grouse. And
yep.
This is a topic that I'm not sure a lot of deer hunters understand or know why they should even care about it at all. But I'm curious. I think that they should. But can you share with us? Okay, perfect. So can you share with us what's been all the hullabaloo about the sage grouse lately over the last 6 months or year, and then why does this matter for deer hunters?
All right. So for those who don't really know what the sage grouse is, it's a very cool western game bird that's population has been steadily declining for the past, probably 50 years. And there are a number of reasons for that decline, from oil and gas development to wind development to grazing to, who knows what else. But the science is pretty clear that the populations have been going down. And what makes this interesting thing is that the sage grouse, the range is probably about 100 million acres in the West. It's a lot of ground. It goes all the way from Montana down, through Utah, and it has impact on a lot of people. So that's why it became such noise that everyone was hearing about, because this bird was petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. And if that had happened, it would have had an impact on literally everything, from oil and gas development to grazing to hunting. And, but in a pretty cool story, folks started to, get together and develop voluntary, conservation plans across the range. And because understanding that as of September 30th, 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to make a decision of whether this was get listed or not. And really that decision was going to be predicated on the fact of how well everyone was coming together to conserve the species without a listing. So you had, about 70% of the habitat is on federal lands. It was mostly BLM lands. You had them involved. You had the Forest Service involved. You had the states involved. The state of Wyoming was a real leader on this one. You had the oil and gas community involved, the grazing community. And basically they came up with a plan that, allowed the Fish and Wildlife Service to say, okay, we're not going to list it. And it is a real showcase in terms of, avoiding the hammer of the ESA, everyone coming together. Now, why does it matter for hunters? I mean, the sage-grouse is a cool species to begin with, but not that many people hunt for them. But it's what we call an umbrella species. So its habitat is critical habitat for about 350 different species, including mule deer and pronghorn and elk. So as the sage-grouse goes, so would go these other species. And and I also think that it's just a really neat example of instead of sort of having this nasty dispute among various parties about what the federal government is going to do to them, they came together and they're doing this stuff themselves. And this is the way it's supposed to work to begin with. Instead of triage after the fact with a federal law, let's conserve habitat well before we have a crisis.
So just to make sure I'm clear on this and everyone else is, there was the risk of the Endangered Species Act, or the sage-grouse being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And if that were to happen, a whole slew of new regulations comes down on habitats and places where there are sage-grouse or where there should be sage-grouse. So, from one side, I'm like, oh, we want good things for sage-grouse, regulations for sage-grouse so that they can, repopulate. But what it sounds like happened is that all these other constituencies, all these different groups said, okay, we want to conserve sage-grouse, we want to help the populations rebound, but if we have these regulations come down, it could be detrimental to a whole slew of things. So rather than wait till it gets so bad that this has to happen, let's proactively, let's take a preemptive strike on conservation and do the right thing now before we get hit with the big stick of the ESA. So that's what happened, right?
That's exactly right. And I think that you could figure out what to do about it locally with various parties, or you can wait and have Washington, D.C. tell you what to do about it later. So I think most people felt the course A was a good route to go.
Yeah. So is this kind of a precedent setter? Is this something that maybe could have a longer term impact, not just for the sage-grouse, but for other conservation or species situations in the future across the whole country?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that I think the Endangered Species Act, there are problems with it. I mean, I think that everyone acknowledges that. But at the same time, it gets a bad rap because, if we get to the point where something has to be listed, we've already screwed it up. So let's use that, out there and have folks come together and do what's right before we get to that point. Because all we're really talking about is just planning. Okay, where can you have development? Where do you not want development? If we're going to do development, how should we do it to minimize its impacts? How do we do mitigation? How do we, sort of fix our fences so the sage-grouse don't fly into them? Where do we site a wind farm? Because, the way sage-grouse have evolved is they don't want to be with anything tall nearby because that's where the predators perch to kill them. So if they see a windmill, they're going to be miles away from it. So, I mean, it's all this idea of just let's plan ahead and how we're going to do development, which makes sense for everybody.
And I guess that's something that, hopefully people will be thinking about, whether it's out west or in Michigan or in Florida or anywhere, right? We want more and more of this working together to try to be smart about, because development is happening, whether you like it or not, unfortunately in some instances, but we have a growing population. This is a country that's expanding. So I hope that this is an example of, okay, if to some degree growth is inevitable, how can we do it in the right way so that we can still preserve habitat and wildlife and all those things, right?
That's exactly right. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks. Dan, what are you thinking over there? What's on your mind as we're going through these different issues? Any other topics you wanted to make sure we talk to Whit about?
Well, just to elaborate, just because something, or it's more of a question, but can you elaborate on if there is a way for expansion and conservation to happen on the same plane?
Yes, I mean, can you do basically development and conservation at the same time? Is that the basic question?
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah. So I think that it goes back to that sort of last comment I made about planning. And I think you can certainly have development and conservation. I mean, listen, there are some areas that are too special to be developed, and you look at a place like the Bristol Bay in Alaska where they proposed a pebble mine. No amount of mitigation or alternative development schemes is going to work there because it's such a fragile and such a unique ecosystem. That's just one of those special places we need to protect. Other places, like where the sage-grouse live, like where a lot of whitetails live, it's you can have development and you can have conservation and species, and they can do really well together as long as you're smart about it. Let science guide it, not emotion, and just come to the table and sort of leave your prejudice at the door and hammer out some solutions.
Yeah, I hope that's this is one of those things that it sounds like that's so easy when you say that, but unfortunately it just seems like it's really difficult to get people to actually do those things, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. But I think there are a lot of cases where, at the local level as well as at a more macro level, like sagegrass, where we see that's happening. I mean, I think that, I used to work for a group called Trout Unlimited, and, we did, a lot of these sort of watershed scale projects that would bring, ranchers, timber industry, fishermen, local, business interests together to figure out, okay, how do we have, a vibrant economy in this basin, but also a really good trout fishery. And, Blackfoot River in Montana, the Wood River in Idaho, there are tons of examples where this has really worked. And, that's the kind of thing that we can replicate any place, as long as there are people willing to come together and work things out.
Yeah. And I feel like this is one of those things when it comes to conservation of landscapes and habitats where, to the point that Dan made and you just made, Whit, there's some places where we can be smart about planning, and we can, there can be wildlife and humans can coexist. And then to your point, Whit, there are also some places that are so special, that are so fragile, that we need to protect them. And I think I think about this a lot. I love wilderness, wide open spaces where you can still get away from it all, where wildlife can exist, uninhibited by humans. And when it comes to all these different things, to landscapes, the fight to conserve habitat, it's one of those things that on our side, or I don't want to say their side, our side, but on the side of protecting habitat for wildlife, that's a fight that you need to continue winning. You're going to be challenged over and over and over again, and you're going to have to come back up. You're going to have to step back up to the plate and fight that fight again and again, because there's going to be people trying to knock it down, trying to develop, trying to do different things. That's going to keep on happening. So even if you win today, probably 3 years from now, you're going to have to go back up to the plate. On the other hand, if you lose that fight, it's lost forever. Once that piece of 40 acres, that terrific whitetail habitat, or that 2,000 acres of mountains or whatever it might be, once that's developed and taken over, that's a piece of wildlife habitat that's probably gone forever in most cases. And so I think it's just, and maybe I'm biased because I'm a sucker for the outdoors, but I feel like this is one of those places where we just have to keep fighting. We have to pay attention to it, and we just have to be involved, because there's not a whole lot of people out there who are thinking and caring about this type of stuff anymore. Most people are watching TV and hanging out in a high-rise and going to the club, and they're not even thinking about it. And I think for the few of us, the so many million hunters and the so many million anglers and the so many million hikers and backpackers and all of us, have to realize that this is a pretty precious resource that if we don't, excuse my French, but if we don't give a damn enough, nobody else will. So that's
Mark, I think you're exactly right about that. And I think the hunters really have a closer connection to that land than anybody else, because you know what it's like. I mean, you get out there and you just become a part of that wilderness, and even wilderness sort of a small W, and it can be your 100 acres behind your house that you hunted since you were a kid. And I think we appreciate it on a very different level. And if we're not going to be willing to speak up, who's going to?
Yeah. So I guess number one, is there any other major issue that we didn't touch on yet that you brought up? And if not, then are there any kind of final thoughts on your end that we all should be keeping in mind moving forward? How can we individuals, again, make an impact on all this? Because we've talked about a whole lot of issues. There's a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of things talked about in Congress and with legislators and all this, and it can be a little intimidating. So I always want to make sure we can try to bring it back to what can I personally do today or tomorrow.
Yeah, listen, I'd much rather talk about, tree stand placement and, scent and all that sort of stuff, just like everybody else would. But, in order for us to enjoy that and have that conversation, we have to have a place to go and hunt and fish and get outside. And, it was the sportsmen, really led by Theodore Roosevelt back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that created this amazing system that we have and that, unfortunately, too many of us take for granted. And if we want that to go on to our kids and our grandkids and their grandkids, we cannot assume that is going to be there if we don't stand up for it. And that's the only message I would just put out there, is that, for too long, we're too happy to, play with our toys and to, really, think about the next hunt and just forget all this other stuff. But I think it's an obligation we all have if we want to continue doing this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Dan, do you have any final thoughts on this topic over there too?
Just, I don't know. Like I said, I'm like the rest of the people out there who are listening. I very rarely think about it until like this, until it's too late. I'm so focused on my family, and I'm so focused on my job and everything else. And then by the time hunting season comes around, you're focused on hunting. So I'm going to make it a goal for myself and challenge everybody else who's listening here to, I'm not saying give all your time, but at least open the book and start reading it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you can just, find some small way to start making an impact, every little bit I think counts. It's so cliche to say, but it's just the truth, right?
And there are a lot of opportunities out there that are fun too. I mean, join your local Turkey Federation chapter, your QDMA group, or whatever it may be. They're cool people. It's fun, and you all are. There's strength in numbers.
Yeah, so true. So speaking of groups, you of course are the CEO and president of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Is there any way that our listeners or ourselves can get involved with what you guys are doing at the TRCP?
Yeah, just go on TRCP. www.trcp.org. You'll learn a lot more about the organization, how we work, what our issues are. You can sign up. It doesn't cost anything to sign up. If you want to give us a gift and get a cool, sort of present in return, we'd love to have it. But what we're really interested in is just having people engage and make your voice heard.
Awesome. Well, I think that that's our goal here too. We hope that everyone listening will think about these different topics we've covered and be curious about them, dive in more, do more research, learn about these things, because the number one thing, the first and foremost priority, I think, is knowledge, right? Understanding these issues. Knowledge is power. Once you understand these things, then you can then begin to see how you can make a difference. And I don't think any one of us, maybe Whit, maybe you can have an impact on all these issues, but I'm not sure any of the rest of us could impact every single one of these. But see what impacts you the most, or where's your passion, or where do you think you could have a disproportionate impact? And then focus there. Spend a day a month or a couple times a year. Think about, maybe I can volunteer some time, or maybe I can take a couple hours this week and send some letters. I know that's a pain in the butt, but maybe this year I'm going to do that. Find some small way to make a difference, and I think obviously it'll make an impact in the long run when it comes to our ability to hunt and fish and have landscapes and habitats to do so. But then also I think it'll be pretty personally fulfilling too. So for whatever that's worth, that's my final preach of the day. But Whit, this has been terrific. I don't know many other people who we could get on this show to speak to so many of these different diverse topics. So we really appreciate the time you took here today.
Well, Mark, listen, I appreciate you guys getting the word out about this. It happens too infrequently. And anytime you want me back on, just let me know. I'm happy to join you.
All right, well, be careful what you offer, because we have been known to do that. So Whit, have a great evening, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Bye, guys.
All right, bye-bye. All right, well, I know that was probably a lot to digest, but these are just some super important issues. And with that being the case, I'm just really glad that Whit was able to help us walk through them. And I'm also glad that you all took the time to hear about these things, because that's an important step. And I know it can be a little overwhelming, I imagine, to hear all these different issues that maybe you weren't aware of, and all of a sudden Whit is dumping a lot of new information on us. So it's kind of hard to keep track of it all. So if you need to listen to it again, I'd encourage you to do that. And of course, as we talked about, if nothing else, try to take some action on some of these items, or at least on one of these items. Whatever it is that compels you the most, do something about it. It's really easy to listen, it's easy to read, it's easy to hear about these things, but what really makes a difference in the end is actually doing something about it. So if I could encourage you to do one thing in particular, I would love to see all of our listeners take one small piece of action regarding the public lands issue that we talked about near the beginning of the show. This is really a serious threat, and it's one that unfortunately does seem to be picking up some steam politically. So we, sportsmen and women, need to make our voices heard. We need to keep our public lands, and we need to keep them accessible to hunters and anglers and productive for wildlife. So, as Whit said, visit sportsmansaccess.org. That's sportsmen with an S, sportsmansaccess.org. Go there to sign that petition and to get more informed on what's going on and what you can do. So if you can, go ahead and do it right after this podcast. It's one of those causes that I think is going to be very worth your time. Now, with all that said, before we wrap this up, we also do need to send a big thank you to the companies that have helped make the Wired to Hunt podcast possible. So big thank you to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Huntera Maps, Ozonics, Carbon Express, Lacrosse Boots, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. And finally, as always, thank you to each and every one of you who tuned in today. I hope you were able to learn a thing or two about what's going on across the country when it comes to conservation, and hopefully you were inspired to take some action. And finally, of course, I hope you'll stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.